Mergers and acquisitions. Have you ever considered growing your business through a merger or an acquisition? If you have, or if you're interested in the process and the pitfalls associated with a merger or an acquisition, this episode of Construction Genius is for you. My guest is Ryan Goral. Ryan is the founder of the G-Spire Group, a company focused on helping entrepreneurs, executives, and small business owners acquire companies. Ryan is an expert in the area of mergers and acquisitions from the buy side of the equation. He knows all about the importance of companies developing a clear strategic vision so they know which companies to go after, identifying targets for possible merger or acquisition, how to go through the due diligence process, how to manage emotions, how to make sure cultures are aligned so that a merger or an acquisition is successful. And all of those topics and more we cover in today's discussion. So if you want a step-by-step process for how to go through a merger or an acquisition, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening to Construction Genius today. Enjoy my conversation with Ryan. Share it with other people. Give me some feedback. Is this type of episode useful to you? I know it was very informative and helpful for me, and I think you'll find it very impactful. This is Eric Anderton, and you're listening to Construction Genius, a leadership masterclass. Thomas Edison said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. If you're a construction leader, you know all about the perspiration, and this show is all about the 1% inspiration that you can add to your hard work to help you to improve your leadership. Ryan, welcome to Construction Genius.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Mergers and acquisitions. It's a great topic. We're thinking about construction companies. I know you've worked with construction companies. Why is an acquisition an effective strategy for growth?
Well, every company is different. The reason for doing an acquisition is going to be different based on each individual company's strategy and vision for their firm. So I'll caveat that. But in general, acquisitions typically allow companies to get to where they're trying to go faster, whether that's just pure growth on revenue, number of employees, whatever the core reason of going into an acquisition is from a strategic perspective. You can go out and hire or go recruit, and that's the organic growth, and that should be part of your strategy. But that tends to be a little bit of a longer road versus finding a company that has similar products or services or adjacent products and services with common in the construction industry. Maybe it's labor that actually can do both skill sets. For example, you go buy that company and all of a sudden you've got 10 to 15 additional labor folks on your team versus going out and recruiting 15. So that's one of the main advantages, is just the speed in which you get to the size that you're trying to get to.
Okay, so let me just pursue that for a minute. Sometimes when we think about mergers and acquisitions or M&As, we're thinking about behemoth X buying semi-behemoth Y. But the way you just described it there, Ryan, is 10 to 15 folks in the field. That's not a massive company by any means. So is a merger or an acquisition an effective strategy for smaller companies as well as larger ones?
It can be. It's one of the big misconceptions of M&A is it's only for the Amazons and the billion, trillion dollar kind of companies. And they do a lot of that growth through acquisitions. But it's what comes into the news and what you're kind of aware of as a news consumer. The misconception is mergers and acquisitions happen all the time in the lower middle market and even in the small business market. And it is an effective growth strategy as long as you do it right and be thoughtful about what you're doing. I use examples to illustrate my points often. And if you have a business that's doing 10 million in revenue, $1 million in cash flow, you've got a nice business. You're not the Amazon of the world, but you've got a beautiful business that's operating well. And to go acquire another $10 million revenue business to get to $2 million of cash flow is a great business. But you would consider that as a small business type of acquisition. And those types of deals happen all the time.
Okay, so then let's pivot back to this idea of strategy. So when I think of strategy for a construction company, it revolves around some fundamentals such as I've got to build the right projects for the right clients in the right locations. So those three fundamentals. And of course, there's tons of complexity underneath that But if I'm going to be profitable, I've got to nail at least two of those three on a consistent basis, if not all three. So when it comes to mergers and acquisitions and the strategic perspective that a company should take, which one, if any, of those three would be more prominent in the decision to buy a company or to merge? Right client, right project, right location.
I think it's equally important, but to distill it down for the construction work that I've done, it isn't usually just one. And it's at least two of those. So I was involved in a project where the contractor both wanted to grow geographically. So there was a location aspect to it, but also as part of that geographic expansion, wanted to provide different product services to their customer base. When you do an acquisition that involves providing different products and services, you are kind of also acquiring a different customer base and a diversified customer base from that acquisition. And so you're kind of covering all of them in a way. But I think it goes back into that strategic planning piece. Where are you trying to go and why? And which one's leading the cause? Is it geography? Yeah, that could be a piece. What I'm seeing more in today's market is definitely driven off of labor. And that labor is also being, in part, combined with sometimes having to provide another product and service as part of that acquisition strategy. And that's what I'm seeing a lot more of in the market today.
So from the perspective of the person who's initiating the transaction or beginning to think about a transaction, in your experience, when is a merger appropriate? When is an acquisition appropriate? Or is it just kind of obvious because they're saying, hey, buy me, or I'm not interested in being bought, I'd rather be merged? Tell us a little bit about that, please.
It's deal by deal specific, and kind of to try to put a silo around the difference between an acquisition and a merger. And there's a million different ways you can do it in between, but just to provide some contrast, an acquisition is typically you're buying an entire company 100%, and the seller, after some transition period, is going to go sit on a beach somewhere and they retire. Now you own the asset and you got the employees and the customers and you've acquired that business. A merger is, in contrast, would be I don't know, everyone has a little different opinion on what a merger of equals would actually look like, if that's even possible. I mean, that's a whole other discussion point, but I was involved in a transaction where it started out to be more of an acquisition. So let's say, hey, we want to buy your company, and the existing shareholders will roll a piece of the transaction into the new company as part of the transaction. So let's say that it started out as we're going to buy 90% of your business, and then the 10% is going to be rolled into our business. And then that seller gets what they call two bites of apple. They get liquidity event upon close, and then they get the bigger company eventually sells. They got that 10% that will get another payday. Well, this transaction I was involved in started at 10% roll and worked its way up. I think it was north of 30. Well, then as more equity is getting rolled, the more it looks like a merger, even though in this case, it clearly was an acquisition. Clearly, this company was buying another company and they were going to own and control. And then it comes down to control. And that's, I guess, the main point of the difference between an acquisition and a merger. But in construction, I see this a lot where the seller will actually roll a bunch of equity. And depending on how much it is, the more they're rolling, the more it looks and smells more like a merger. So that would be kind of a key differentiator, is how involved is the seller and the management team of the seller in the business post-transaction, whether it's really classified as technically a acquisition or technically a merger.
Okay, so there's two aspects here that I'm interested in. You've got the money issue and the control issue, and those two are related, right? So the more money I put in, the more control I get. If I'm pursuing a merger strategy from a financial perspective, that is, either I don't have the money or I don't want to put as much money in, and so therefore I'm willing to give up some control. If you can think of one, what is the pivot point where you have sufficient control so that the challenges of power are mitigated or reduced as much as possible? Am I clear in my question?
I think so. I think I'm tracking. So I think where you're going, it is a money and a control. You're right there. What you'll see in the market too is with companies that don't necessarily have the capital or want to expend their capital into a transaction, it is kind of a, hey, why don't you just merge and I'll give you X amount of equity in the business and we'll run together. And part of that running together comes into how is this going to look from a control perspective. And that's where it gets pretty dicey because there's no money coming out the door for the seller at closing, or maybe there's a little bit, but it's not a liquidity event. So it's more of what I look at is who's bringing what to the party? What are the capabilities? Then what are the needs of the business once combined? Because clearly the seller has some skill sets and some know-how that can contribute to the overall organization as a combined unit. So it's more of an organizational design type of project. Who does what? Who's going to be responsible for what? How do we cut down or how do we break up the distribution of profits? And who has control over what? And that all gets negotiated based on kind of the specific needs of the business, the specific capabilities of each of the businesses that are coming together.
So as you're advising someone and you're going through the process and they have a strong drive to want to get the deal done, but you're seeing red flags, which red flags are you looking for the most? I find that a lot of entrepreneurs, sometimes they get into fantasy land and people like yourself are there to kind of give them a gentle slap upside the head and say, hey, listen, let me give you a little bit of a reality check here. What are the red flags for you in a deal that tell you to talk to your client, even though it might detriment you personally, Ryan, where you don't get a liquidity event as a result of your services? What are those red flags? Tell me about those.
One of the things about my business that I try to pride myself on is I'm not getting paid on the transaction. So I'm a retainer-based model. So I kind of remove any kind of messiness around incentives. But to your question, the red flags, I love this question because as much as M&A is people are thinking about money and financials and operations, it's all pretty, call it tactical, black and white type of stuff. What makes these deals really successful or really a disaster is the human aspect of the deal. And that comes down to one of the biggest red flags for me is culture and core value alignment. Kind of a tricky thing to assess, but it's important. You got to at least try to put it together when you're a buyer looking at a target acquisition. The other red flag that I often see is the emotional side of a deal. So exciting. It's a shiny object. I'm going to double my company. I love the thought of telling people that I acquired a business. Like there's that emotional stuff. And a lot of the work I do on the front end of an engagement is really getting clear on the strategic vision and making sure that the acquisition strategy is a part of that vision, not the other way around. The strategy isn't just going and acquiring. We're trying to get to here, and here's how acquisitions can facilitate that growth. And when I see an owner fall in love with a deal, it's brake pumping time. And not to say we won't do it, but when I start seeing the emotional kind of, I want to do this deal, you kind of start getting blinded to the objectiveness of, does this deal fit? Every deal has risk. Are we glazing over the risk here? Or are we going to try to deal with it a way around deal structure or the integration project? Let's just not fall in love with the deal. So those would be two big red flags. And they're both human and emotional pieces where I would say, hey, can we just need to talk about this? And let's go back to the drawing board of why we're doing what we're doing. What are the specific criteria that we're looking for? I'm seeing XYZ here. It doesn't seem like that's registering as a risk. So let's talk about it. Yes, slapping someone and just kind of waking them up is like to pride myself on making sure that there's an open line of communication where there's no slapping needed. There's a way to honestly have these discussions in an open format, but sometimes you got to shake the owner to wake them up.
Ryan, so you mentioned there with the red flags, this idea of culture. And there's been tons of books written about that and why it's all important. But just for our audience here, what do you mean by culture?
It's one of those things that it's hard to define with words. And it's one of those things that you know it when you see it or feel it. So it is a hard thing to assess when you're sizing up an acquisition. But as I look at it, I'm working with these buyers and they have a set of core values that sets the stage for their culture. When we look at a target company, you're not going to find the same 5 core values on their wall. It's not going to be a mirror image. What you're looking for is some similarities because you can read those core values and there's a story of how those became to be, and which can inform the culture. That'd be kind of my first step. And then the second step is when you talk to a target company owner or seller, there's the questions that you ask, how they respond. It's the nuances of the answers that will give you a little bit of a sense to what their culture is. It's when you start asking certain questions around employees, how they're managed. Is there a bunch of overtime? How do they manage that? Usually their answers will have additional narrative that will suggest, oh, sounds like you've got some challenged employees that are leaving too early. Or, oh, it sounds like you're pretty hard on these employees. I wonder how they're taking that. You kind of read through it. But the answer to the importance of culture has to be at least some alignment. And if you put two different cultures together, it is infinitely more hard to do an integration because it's really apples and oranges and pulling it all together. Venture to say, I'm sure there's ways to do it. It is really hard to do an integration of two companies that have drastically different cultures.
Do you have an example in your experience of that culture fit in terms of a merger or an acquisition?
Yeah, I've seen it a lot. One example would be, without naming names, an organization that is typically working with, let's just say, some bigger companies. They're used to selling into Fortune 100, bigger, middle market, bigger companies. And let's say they also are very conservative and run a tight process, checking boxes. Everything is a process and there's a lot of paperwork and it's very formal. Let's say that company goes and likes what company B is doing. And company B, their culture is more Wild West. They don't really document things. They do things with relationships. They work with smaller, fast, nimble, entrepreneurial companies. So that would be one example where company A buying company B, a lot of transformation would have to happen to make that situation work. They're serving different clients. They're doing it in a different way. The processes are different. Not to say it couldn't work, but that would be kind of one of those drastic cultural differences that would make that integration a lot harder.
Yeah, I could see the difference where you might have some companies that are more family oriented and quote unquote caring. Then you have other companies that are more competitive and more driven, where the expectations in terms of the amount of time you're spending either in the office or on the project site are completely different than one other company.
100%. That's what defines those core values and culture. And it's the type of customers that they're serving. The types of customers that the company serves also attracts a certain type of employee. So all of this is very intertwined.
Another aspect that you mentioned earlier in terms of the red flag are the emotions that someone gets that tend to overwhelm them and drive them. Now, we all know that we're all along the spectrum of objectivity to emotion, and depending on the circumstances, it goes up and down. One rules over the other. What are some of the main emotions that you've seen that negatively impact someone's ability to objectively look at a deal and figure out if it's the best for them?
That's a tough one. I think in my experience, what I've seen is there's something underlying the purpose and the why of going out and doing an acquisition. And if that underlying purpose is rooted in a place of insecurity, let's say my friend just bought a company and now I have to go do one. Or maybe it's fear. If I don't go do this, my company will fail because of XYZ. And not to say that those are discounted, because maybe there's some reality there, but it produces an emotion. It produces an emotion that puts blinders on what is being objectively looked at in a merger and acquisition. So it's why a lot of the prep work I do with my clients, there's a lot of that readiness work. It's asking why a lot. Why do we want to do this? What does this look like when it's done? Why is that important to you? And it's trying to peel back the onion a little bit to try to get to that core why, not to judge it, but so I can better help coach and mentor along the process of what that driving why is and what potentially could produce an adverse emotion that could derail a deal. Or the other side of it is get a deal done that's completely wrong for them. And that hyper focus on got to do a deal, got to do a deal, got to do a deal, that could be a pretty detrimental effect of that emotion.
Let's say I'm listening to the podcast. I'm thinking, well, I know I've got a competitor in the next town over, and they seem to be a good fit in terms of the culture. I know that the guy or the gal that's going to be retiring in the next 3 to 5 years. It could be a potential acquisition. What does this process look like from start to finish? Where should I, as a construction company owner, start in determining whether or not I should pursue a merger or an acquisition? And then just walk us step by step through what something like that looks like practically.
Yeah, sure. So the first step is kind of back to what I was talking about with trying to understand the why. Why are we wanting to go buy that competitor in a neighboring town? What's the strategic purpose of doing it? And then
So that begs the question that you have to be clear on your strategy to begin with.
Exactly. So there is that strategy, and I call it strategy readiness work. It's not necessarily, it is readiness work, but it's more, let's make sure that the strategic alignment in your vision is clear. And then let's go then from that baseline, figure out, if an M&A strategy is even right for you. And then if it is, what specific companies would make sense?
If I can just put a bookmark here, just for everyone listening here, the idea there is fundamentally, as a construction company, I need to know right client, right project, right location, and have built a plan for success around those things where I currently am before I look to spread my wings through a merger or an acquisition.
Well put. That's exactly it. It's having that clarity of who you are, what you do really well, and just having that dialed in before we even say if that competitor in that neighboring town is the right fit. They may be available. There may be a relationship there, but we don't know if it's going to be a good strategic fit until we know what we're looking for. So that would be kind of step one, is that let's dial in our strategy and our vision, and then we build out the plan. What types of companies, where are they located, what they look and smell like, and then we build out a target list for companies to start talking to, building relationships with.
All right, so that's the second step, is the target list. Tell me a little bit more about that target list.
So as part of that strategic mapping process, we'll get really clear on what types of companies we want to go after. What do they look like? Where are they to your location? What kind of customers are they serving to the extent that we know? And then we do the research. We go out and build a list of companies that are in those geographical areas. And there's tools out there. I use a tool that can build lists that pretty efficiently based on certain demographics, size estimates, that kind of thing. So you build that proprietary list, what I call proprietary, which is these companies are not for sale. These are companies that aren't currently listed for sale. The parallel process to that is let's start putting together.
Hold on for a second. Hold on.
Sure.
So you're building a list of companies not for sale, but that could be targets.
That would be a list that we would reach out to say, are you interested in a dialogue about selling?
Now, why would you do it that way as opposed to just looking for companies that are for sale?
There's a number of reasons. You have to go look at the companies that are for sale, because I think that these are companies that are ready.
You should look at those companies that are for sale.
You're doing both. Looking at the ones that are for sale. You're working with the brokers and the investment bankers and the community where they're listed. And there's definitely a process there. But there's also, those are what's available. But there's all these other companies that aren't for sale, but maybe you're thinking about it, that could be a better fit.
In your experience, Ryan, with the deals that you've been involved in, what percentage are the ones that were already for sale and the ones where the deal identified the ones that aren't for sale, but it became a deal as you went through the process? Do you have an idea of that?
Oh man, that's a good question. I would say most of the deals I've worked on have been deals that were ready to sell. They were with a broker or banker, but there is a minority of those off markets. I'd say minority, not as in like 5%, but there's a healthy amount of transactions that happen that are not on market.
Okay. Would you say like upwards of 20%?
Call it 20 to 25%, I think would be.
So not insignificant there.
Not insignificant, but not a majority.
Do you have any clients who have like sort of a long-term perspective where they're saying, Ryan, I'd like to make an acquisition in the next year to 2 years and then maybe another one in the next 3 to 4 years. And so I want to cultivate these long-term relationships with people where a deal may not get done this year?
Yeah, I'm often advising that to my client, actually, because these things take time. The best deals, I feel like, come from relationships, and especially these off-market deals. It's relationships with the business owner. You get to know their business through the lunches and the dinners or what the relationship building stuff that you do. And over time, you can pretty much get a sense of whether that company is going to be a good fit through that relationship. And then once the relationship is bonded and that person's ready to sell, you've got the relationship, you're in point A. Do they really want to go down the marketing process? If they really know that you're going to come in and take care of their people, take care of their customers, their employees, there's already a good relationship. You've already determined there's a good match. I'd say that you're in a good position. Not to say it would always work, but you are in point A to get a company that you know is a good fit due to that relationship. And oftentimes it doesn't happen the minute you start looking for an acquisition. It's usually a year or two down the road.
Right. Okay. So when it comes to building those relationships, then are you advising your clients to go in and contact the people and say, hey, listen, I'm interested in possible acquisitions down the road. You want to grab lunch and just get to know each other a little bit. Is that how you approach it, or is there another strategy?
There's that strategy. If they're comfortable with that, it's part of the service that I offer. You bring in a third party or someone as part of your team and say, hey, I'm here to specifically drive growth through acquisitions. I want to make sure we know each other and let's build a relationship and let's grab lunch and let's just start a conversation, see where it goes. And so, yeah.
So for your clients, are you going to that first lunch just to get to know them and kind of vet them a little bit? Or are you directly introducing the president of one company with the president of another?
A lot of times for efficiency and for time's sake, I'm handling the first couple meetings myself just to fact find, build a relationship, understand a little bit more of the details of that company before I bring in my client. If it's not a good fit, I don't want to waste my client's time. That's part of the reason why.
When do you reveal who your client is? Right up front or later on? How does that work?
It's kind of personal preference and it's an art. So some clients are like, use my name. Some are like, it might be beneficial just to say you have a client and you want to spur up a conversation and see how far you can go without. And maybe we get an NDA down the road. It kind of depends on my client's desire and strategy around it that we all kind of configure before I start doing outreach. We put together a very defined do's and don'ts on kind of how we feel comfortable going forward with these off-market conversations because they can be sensitive, especially with competition and get into that mix. So sometimes there's a benefit for a third party to strike up a conversation, say, I've got a client that's interested. He's XYZ of not name, but this is kind of what we're up to and we're capitalized. We've got the right strategy. We think that you would be a good fit. Are you open to a conversation? You don't share their name up front. You don't share their name until you get down the road and maybe there's an NDA that's needed just to protect everybody. So it's personal preference from a case-by-case basis.
You understand the why. You've got a strategic clarity. You have a target list. You begin to reach out to people. Let's say there is some interest there. What would be the next step? I mean, regardless of whether or not I'm using someone like yourself, if I know that there's an interest there, how would you advise someone to proceed so that they don't get over their skis and everything is as rational as possible?
Yeah. So once you find a target company that you're interested in, so there's usually NDAs, and what you would want is some preliminary financial package. So you can kind of understand the revenue, maybe some cash flow figures. They're probably not at that stage, probably not sharing customer names and some of that stuff, but you're trying to just get a sense on, in general, how much revenue and cash flow does this company produce?
So when you're looking at the financial package, where are you directing your clients to look immediately to raise those red flags that are going to go no-go from the financial statement perspective?
It's a quick analysis of revenue trends is where my eyes go. And then it goes immediately down to the cash flow trends and margins to pretty quickly size up. Is this thing going in the right direction, or are they trying to sell because their revenue has dropped 20% a year for the last 4 and it looks like something's wrong here?
All right. So in construction, COVID hit. We took a little dip for 90 days, but then generally speaking, construction's been doing pretty well. At the time of recording, we're in October 2022. So there's this teetering is happening at the moment with the financial markets and the economy. How do you balance all of that when there's maybe some either regional or national ups and downs that a company may be experiencing, and yet fundamentally they're a strong company? How do you discover that from the financial reports perspective, if that's at all possible?
It's challenging, but I think knowing the industry and its sensitivity to certain things like COVID, you have to be able to underwrite through it. Right now is a particularly challenging time to wrap your arms around the fluctuations of business. You have the longest 10-year bull run. And then you have COVID. And then you got this kind of rebound out of COVID. And now we're staring at this potential recessionary environment and inflation environment. So you got to kind of underwrite forward thinking out of this kind of noise historically. It's definitely not easy. But if you have a sense and can wrap your head around, well, clearly 2020, here's the quantifiable effects of COVID. We understand that XYZ happened and the business couldn't function for whatever, 3 to 6 months. Well, then you chalk it up to that was the event and did they recover? The other flip side is some of these companies did better through COVID. So there's the reverse. It's the what is normalized going forward. That's really the art of the exercise, is figuring out what is this thing on a normal basis. And then you're throwing what's normal, what are the guardrails on normal in inflation in a recessionary environment. It's challenging, but you are mapping it out and trying to make sense of it the best you can.
So I'm going to ask a dumb question here, and I think this is a relevant one. So let's say 2020, 2021, you're looking at a company and they got some PPP. And we know that depending on your size, that's a substantial amount of cash. In those statements, would it be easy to see where that PPP is? Or are some companies able to hide it and kind of stuff it in a project to make a project look more profitable or more revenue driven than it actually is?
Yeah, good question. It really comes down to the quality of financials that you're getting from that target client. Quality of financials is a huge part of this process. And there's also a little bit of ask the questions to the target company. Did you take PPP? That's a normal question. And hopefully they're telling you the truth, but you can verify later if they did. I actually think that type of information is public, I think. Don't quote me on that. But there's ways to uncover it. But to your question, it's you got to understand those types of things and be able to either back that out of performance or add back certain things that were negatively impacted and then reduce things that were maybe a positive impact and try to normalize to the extent that you can.
So once we've sat down, we've taken a look at the financials. Let's say there's no glaring red flags. I want to continue the process. Give us the next step, please, Ryan.
Yeah, so then I typically advise getting your legal counsel involved and help put together a letter of interest that you put in front of the seller. And the letter of interest is non-binding outside of confidentiality and some other kind of points in the letter, but it's here's what we want to offer your business. Some folks call it an indication of interest before. There's some nuances there, but essentially you're going to put in an offer and you should be using a lawyer to make sure you have proper protections and outs and language in those letters. But the financials will tell you what you think it's worth. And if you're using debt, how much debt service can this company service? And there's some analysis that goes into what you think that offer should be. If you don't know, sometimes the seller will kind of give you a couple numbers throughout the process of what they're hoping for. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they want to see what you are going to bring to the table out of the blue. So every situation is different. And then you put it out an offer and a structure and you let them respond to what you're offering them. And that kind of ends the pre part of that phase. If they don't accept it, then you're kind of moving on to the next one. If they do accept it, you kind of kick off due diligence. And that's kind of the next step.
All right. So due diligence then. Tell me the essential elements of due diligence.
Yeah, it's basically trying to understand the business to the best of your ability. Aspect, financial, operational, all the technology, their human resources, their leadership, their employee, all of it. You just want to get your arms around.
The culture piece would go in there?
Yeah, it's all of that. You're basically saying, is this a business that we want to buy? Does it fit with our organization? And then what are the risks of this business that we might need to be able to, hopefully, by that stage, you've kind of had a sense of the business, but you're trying to flush out if there's any big deal breakers as early as you can. And then the other part of due diligence is, yes, it's understanding the business, understanding the numbers, the employees, and the culture, but you're also prepping for what are the opportunities? Why am I interested in buying this business? And what are the opportunities that we want to get after right after we buy them? And that kind of goes into the integration process once you close. And then the other part of due diligence is usually the capital. So you're usually going out and organizing banks and maybe some equity investors if that's part of the capital needs. And then you close. And then there's integration. That's the last kind of phase of it.
Okay, so going to the due diligence, obviously looking at the initial financials is the first sort of go, no go. Let's say that's good. You go into the due diligence. Do you recommend a particular order that someone should do their due diligence in, or is it just depending on the individual company who's doing the acquisition, which order they go in? What's your experience there?
Well, what I typically, at least the lens that I bring, and I'm not saying I do it perfectly every time, but the lens I bring to a transaction is, what are the big things? Let's identify the big muscle movements. If you reviewed the financials and there was a downward trend in 2022, a year to date, and that information of doing due diligence on why that trend is happening will blow up the deal, you start there. Right? You want to identify the things that are most concerning as early as possible. It kind of follows the 80-20 rule. What 20% of information can you get that's going to tell 80% of the story? And start there. Every deal is going to be different. You might start in operations and human resources first if there's some reason to do that. But I'd say down the middle of the fairway, what typically happens is you start that financial due diligence. Financials is a big part of the due diligence process. You're not necessarily having to do that alone. There's financial CPAs and there's even contract CFOs who can do some work to reconcile financials. There's quality of earnings you can get. As a CPA firm can come in and do a deep dive on the financials to make sure everything ties out, which I typically would advise is a good idea. Not always the case, but in a lot of cases, it does help to have the quality of earnings. But then, financial, and then you just kind of go down the list. You had operations, what's their technology, what are they running on? How are the employees managed? Are they W-2? Are they 1099? What platforms are they on? How are they getting paid? Do you have organizational docs and employee manuals, and just trying to gather all this and digest it over the due diligence period, which typically is call it 120 days to, it can go longer if there's hiccups, but call it 4 to 7 months. It's taken a while. It shouldn't take that long, but 120 to 150 days for these smaller transactions is typically doable.
And when you say smaller, what kind of dollar amount are you talking?
The transactions I'm typically working with companies that are doing anywhere from 5 to 40 million in revenue. And those are companies that are probably doing $500,000 up to 2 to 3 million of cash flow a year. And if you're buying a company that is half your size, most of my transactions are less than $10 million transaction sizes. So those are $1 to $3 million cash flow companies that are being acquired. That's typically what I'm working.
As we're going through this, I'm thinking of the analogy of the couple that they're always talking about getting married, but they never get married. You know what I'm saying? One side of the family is always bugging them. When are you going to get married? When do you get married? As you're working with someone in a merger and an acquisition, let's say one of your clients is really pumped about buying this company, but you can tell that the other company is just maybe stringing them on for whatever reason, or it's just not going to happen. What are some of those warning signs that you look for in the person who's being acquired that tell you that, hold on a second, I need to have a heart-to-heart with my client and let them know I'm not sure if they're going to make this commitment?
It's a really good question. It's really hard to answer because it's part of what I try to do is set expectations with my clients. These deals are not done until the ink dries on the paper, and it can fall apart inning 1 or inning 9. It really can. The M&A process is different for every deal, and it's what I love about it. But it's also what's super challenging with it is because every deal, you can have the ups and downs. You can have the seller go dark for a period of time and you're like, oh man, what's going on over there? What are they off or what's going on? You're always kind of making these, where are they? Something's changed. I don't know. It can be that kind of bumpy emotional roller coaster. And then you find out, oh, they just went on vacation, didn't tell anybody. Like there's nothing wrong with the deal. They're okay. They're still gung-ho, but there's things like that will pop up. It's one of those things you don't want to be too high or too low. But keep your expectations in check. Know that the deal could fall apart at any point. Keep your excitement in check. But the things on the seller, I think that when you see someone it changes. So if they were super responsive and getting you information on the front end, and then something changes where they are not giving you information or giving it to you super slow or the quality has changed, it might not mean anything, but it could mean something. So it's just, those are the things that you're kind of watching out for. Is there a change? Is there a reason for the change? What kind of communication do we have lined up with the seller? What's that relationship like? There's a lot that goes into that, the management of that process. To answer your question, what I try to do is make sure my client has their expectations set up front where they're expecting the worst but hoping for the best. And I'm there to kind of help them through that and identify when things are feeling out of whack and doing the best we can on a case-by-case basis.
Do you ever advise that a company go after two acquisitions in tandem with the expectation that one may not go through and another? What I'm trying to say there, is it worth doing that kind of stuff, going after two deals at once as opposed to just one at a time?
Yeah, I'd have to say that's situational. I mean, I typically, let's just say this. I would, up until a letter of interest is accepted, yes, as long as there's a fit. But to go into a letter of interest and due diligence with two different companies, maybe there's a situation where that makes sense. But I would typically, I mean, unless you have a huge team and you have capacity to look at all that and the capital providers are okay with it and you've got the capacity and the know-how, and then typically when that would happen is you've already built the M&A muscle as a core competency in your business and you've done 10 deals before and you're okay, we've got our playbooks, we've got our cadence, we know what we're doing, then maybe. But if you're on your first one, definitely not. You pick one, go at it. It would probably be my recommendation on that.
So it sounds then that there's an importance to having a clear funnel defined with go, no goes, so that when you're in the sort of the deal making part of the funnel, you're just doing one deal at a time, particularly like you said, as you're getting going on this kind of process.
And that's why it's so important to do the strategy work, know exactly what you're looking for, build the funnel of those companies. So once they get down to the bottom, it's a company you really want. Now, it doesn't guarantee you're going to get it, but at least you're not spending time on something that you haven't done that prep work on.
Let me ask you about the integration. How much work do you do with your clients when it gets to the integration phase? So the deal's done, there's been an exchange of money, whatever the case is. What do you do with them there?
So every company's a little different there. It comes down to their team, who's got capacity. Do they have someone that wants to run point on it? Typically where my role has been is during due diligence, all that you're gathering all this information. And then you're identifying, ooh, that needs to be addressed in the first 30 days. Got it. So I'm building a project plan that's the first 100 days integration plan in parallel for due diligence for my clients. So once we acquire it, here's day one. Here's all the things we need to do. Here's all the things we want to accomplish in the first 30 days, 60 days, first 100 days. It's just project management at that point, but someone's got to put it together. So that is naturally something I do. Who actually project manages, who's doing what by when and staying on top of it can be me, but sometimes they have someone on their team that wants to do it. So it's situational.
So tell us just from an implementation perspective, what are some of the high level things that I should be hitting in the first 90 to 120 days as I'm integrating this new company into my company?
First 100 days, in my opinion, are the most risky because there's the reputation of the company, the employees and the customers. You want to kind of come in with a plan, communicate. It's really a communication plan is a big part of it. It's how are you communicating to your employees day one? How are you communicating to your customers day one? And then it's all the tactical stuff, bank accounts, getting switched over, making sure all the systems it's all that kind of stuff. But I'd say that in the first 100 days, every deal is different and you're trying to accomplish different things. But essentially, you're trying to take two different companies. Hopefully they're not super different. And you're trying to create one platform. You want everyone on the same system, running the same process or similar process. Customers navigate it over. It's acting as one, or at least moving in the right direction of acting and being one company as much as you can, as long as that's part of the plan. Some companies want to operate separately for a period of time, which sometimes that can make sense. But what you want to do is make everybody, mostly employees, suppliers, and customers, super comfortable with who you are, how you do business, and continue to execute on your services or products, if you're a product company, in a way that they don't have a reason to think that the acquisition is creating a negative thing for them, their life, their business. You want to keep executing is probably the main fundamental thing with that integration is don't mess it up, keep executing and keep providing service and try not to let the impactful happen.
So it's interesting, just to back up to the top of the funnel, so to speak, you begin with understanding the why and the strategic perspective of why we're doing this acquisition or an acquisition. You then develop that target list of either available companies or companies that may not be available, some of those diamonds in the rough perhaps, or those hidden gems. You then begin to establish relationships From there, if there's a fit, you go to taking a look at the financials. Then you get the legal counsel involved with an LOI at some point, a letter of interest. And then if they accept that, you go through the due diligence process. That go into negotiations. If the negotiations are successful, you then go into the integration. Did I get that process just about right?
Perfect. Yeah, that's roughly the process there.
Okay, so in your experience then, as you look at that rough process that I just outlined, just give us in your experience, the one or 2 points where most people fail.
That's a good one. I think definition of failure obviously is an important one. I think for buyers in the market, finding a company, building a relationship with the right type of company takes a lot of time, effort, discipline, and effort, or consistent effort, I should say. And what I would say around that is most companies are not doing the work needed to uncover the types of opportunities that are the right fit. They're relying on things falling in their lap. They're relying on a broker network. Again, those things are okay. You can find stuff that fits in that. But if it's not it's just like going to the gym. If it's not a muscle you're building and not actively working at it, the chances of you finding that being successful are going to be a lot lower. So I would say mostly it's that not putting in the work needed that will result in what you're trying to accomplish, which is a successful merger and acquisition or multiple mergers and acquisitions. So I'd say that's the big one. And then the other one, the integration that we talked about, is the other place where it kind of gets a bad rap because I think integrations get fouled up. And integrations get fouled up because it's considered an afterthought. And it can't be. It's where the transaction it's where the model comes in and it's real. You got to pay attention to all the details. And what ends up happening is everyone's so focused on getting the deal closed. And it's a big lift. You've got multiple parties. You got the seller. You're negotiating. You're doing due diligence. You've got all these. You got the banks and the documentation and their requirements and the process and the timelines. You got all the stuff you're trying to manage. It's really hard to go, and I'm going to spend all this time building out a first 100-day integration plan. Like that's just a lot of work to handle. And a lot of people will just say, well, I'll integrate. We'll just figure it out. And so I'd say those two things would be the two places where if attention is not put, probability of success is lower.
So I love that. Those are two pivot points, one up top with not doing enough hard work there, and then one down bottom, not doing enough hard work at the end. It's kind of like when you hire someone, sometimes when people hire people, they're like, phew, my job's done. I'm like, no, your job just got started.
That's a good analogy. It's exactly that way.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's funny as you talk about this too, because I think about when I talk to my clients about succession planning, for instance, I advise them that you should start succession planning as soon as you start your business, even if you're going to be running it for 20, 30, 40 years, whatever the case may be. And it's interesting for a company. Would you recommend that a company, when they're beginning or early on, even if they've never even thought about a merger or an acquisition, to begin to think in those terms because it is a legitimate strategy to grow your business?
Succession planning is interesting because a lot of my clients, at least a part of the discussion is the benefits of making an acquisition. What those benefits translate into is value, the value of the business, depending on what industry and whatnot. But typically, the size alone will enhance the value of the business. And if you're trying to exit in 3, 5, 7 years, of course, you're going to want to try to do what you can to enhance that value. So it's a natural part of the discussion. It's not right for everybody. And there's a whole host of reasons why it wouldn't be. But there's a whole host of reasons why it could be a sound strategy to grow your business. What I often say, I'm working with a lot of these owner operators who are head down in the weeds. They don't have time to really work on this. A lot of the discussions I have is there's a lifestyle improvement. If you move yourself out of the day-to-day of the business, you're going to make the business more valuable. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to sell it. It's just you're improving the value and you can make that decision when you get to that point. But I'm with you in the camp of, I think it's smart to always improving the value of the business, prepping it like it might need to be sold tomorrow in a pinch, and doing the things that are necessary to kind of prep to sell it, even if you don't have any intent on selling it. I think prepping it to sell is just a lot of times translates into just good business practices.
You've been very generous just outlining the whole process really in a very helpful way. Can you tell us a little bit more about you, the work that you do, your business, all these kinds of things?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, this is what I do for my clients. I come in as a part of their management team and help grow their businesses through strategic mergers and acquisitions. help with these owner operators who don't have the time to do this work, but there's tons of opportunity to go out and grow this way. So I come in and drive this specific growth strategy on their part of their team on their behalf. Everything from helping with the strategy alignment, target list, outreach, due diligence, capital, and integration. I'm basically head of the spear on that, all those efforts throughout the process. And we do that as a fractional executive. So we come in and we're monthly retained type of service. And our passion and my passion is building businesses. I love this stuff. I think there's opportunities for smaller businesses to grow this way. And I'm really excited about unlocking this growth channel for companies that maybe never thought about it, never had time to explore it. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there.
And just so we have it clearly stated, what sort of geography are your clients in that you work with? And what are the sizes of the companies that you work with, et cetera?
Sure. So I work with companies all over the country, location agnostic, if you will. A lot of the work I do can be done anywhere. And then I get on a plane for the times that it's important to be in person. So it's pretty flexible that way. And then the size of the companies I'm typically working with are revenues of 5 to 40 in revenue, which translates to 500 grand to 700 grand of cash flow, up to 2 million in cash flow is kind of the sweet spot of companies that typically are owner operator, have great businesses, lots of great opportunities for growth, but maybe stretched a little thin at the leadership level. And pretty agnostic. I have done a lot of work in the construction engineering space. So this podcast is near and dear for me, but I work with all kinds of different industries as well.
Excellent. And how can people get in touch with you, Ryan?
Yeah, so my website, www.gspiregroup.com, has my information, email Ryan, R-Y-A-N, @gspiregroup.com. I am active on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm pretty easily found. Would love to help those who are interested in potentially looking at this as a growth avenue.
Excellent. And we'll link in the show notes to your socials and your website and your email. Really appreciate you coming on, Ryan. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Hey, this is Eric. Thank you for listening to today's episode with Ryan Goral. Check out all the links in the show notes so that you can get in touch with Ryan if you'd like to learn more about the work that he does. And in addition, in the show notes, I'm going to put a link to my new book, Construction Genius. It is available on Amazon, and it is the one book that you need to read if you are a construction leader. It's all about how to be more effective in your leadership, how to develop strategies that enable your business to grow and succeed, and how to master one of the greatest challenges for many construction executives and company owners, and that is sales and marketing. All of that packed into one book, Construction Genius. Go out to the link in the show notes to check out the book. Go to Amazon, buy the book for you and for the people in your organization. I know it will have a tremendous positive impact. Thanks for listening today.